It was a late evening flight from New York to Miami, the kind of flight where passengers were already tired from the hustle of the day and just wanted to get home. They barely noticed when the flight attendants began their rounds. But there was one passenger in seat 14C who caught Sarah's attention. He looked unsteady as he fumbled with his drink, spilling some onto his lap. Sarah had seen this before. It wasn't unusual for passengers to overindulge during long flights, but something about this passenger seemed off. He wasn't shouting or acting belligerent, but there was a slight sway to his movements that made her uncomfortable. She watched him from the back of the plane as he tried to settle into his seat, his eyes glazed over, but not in the way of someone who was clearly intoxicated. Something didn't sit right with her. She had been a flight attendant for over 10 years and could usually tell when someone was drunk. But this felt different. His behavior was subtle, almost as if he was trying to hide it, or was unaware of it herself. Included, no one had complained about him yet, but Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. She made her way down the aisle and stopped by his seat. She leaned in with a polite smile, but there was a sharpness in her eyes. "Sir, I need to ask you to stay in your seat for the remainder of the flight. It's for your safety." The man looked at her slowly, as if her words had not quite registered. He blinked once, then twice. His movements were slow and deliberate. He seemed to be searching for something in his pockets. She waited for him to respond, but he didn't speak. Instead, he simply nodded, and that's when Sarah noticed it. His hand trembled, not from the usual signs of drunkenness, but something else. His face seemed flushed, like he was holding in something. She could feel her instincts prickling. She had been in enough situations to know when something was off, yet, as the seconds ticked by, the man did nothing to confirm her suspicion, and that made Sarah uneasy. She stepped away and continued her service, but her eyes lingered on him the rest of the flight. No one else seemed to notice or care, but Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that something was terribly wrong. She decided to speak to the captain, and after a quick conversation with him, he suggested she call for a crew member to assist if necessary. Sarah felt a sense of relief, but still confusion. She had been sure he was drunk. She had seen it 100 times before, but this time felt different, like she was missing something. The rest of the flight seemed to drag on with Sarah's mind racing back and forth over the events she had witnessed. She noticed the man again as he sat quietly with his head resting against the window, now calm, but still very much out of sorts. The landing was smooth. The flight attendants made their final checks, and the plane touched down. And as it taxied to the gate, Sarah saw the man stand up to gather his belongings, her gaze never leaving him. She watched as he moved toward the exit, but then he stumbled slightly, not enough to draw attention, but enough to catch her eye. She hesitated before walking towards him. "Sir, I'm afraid I'll have to report your behavior to security. You've been acting erratically throughout the flight." His eyes met hers this time with a look of confusion and something else. Was it fear? Was he sick? Had she misjudged him entirely? Sarah felt her stomach twist, but she stood firm. She had to do this. She didn't want to be the reason the man caused trouble later, but she didn't expect what happened next. As she reported her concerns to her superior, her colleague took one glance at the man and asked if Sarah had noticed the strange shaking in his hands, or his pale complexion, or the fact that he hadn't touched his drink the entire flight. It was then Sarah realized the truth. She had misjudged him entirely. Sarah stood frozen in place as the realization hit her. Like a wave, she had made a mistake. Her heart began to race, and her palms grew clammy. The man wasn't drunk at all. He was sick, very sick, and she had misjudged him in front of everyone. She glanced over at the man, who was now quietly talking to a paramedic who had just arrived. The paramedic was nodding his head and taking notes, but Sarah could see the worry in his eyes. His hands moved swiftly to check the man's pulse and his breathing. The flight attendants were still finishing up the last few procedures for disembarking, but Sarah couldn't shake the guilt she felt. The man hadn't caused any trouble throughout the flight, but she had accused him of something that wasn't true. Her supervisor walked up to her with a grim look on his face. "Sarah, are you sure you were right about him?" he asked, his voice low and controlled. She swallowed hard and nodded. "I thought he was drunk," she said quietly, her voice trembling just slightly. "But he's not." Her supervisor studied her for a moment, his expression unreadable. He turned to the paramedic. For a brief exchange, Sarah could hear bits and pieces of the conversation, but none of it reassured her. The man was shaking uncontrollably now, pale as a ghost, his eyes closed tightly, as if trying to fight something inside of him. And then the words she heard next made her stomach drop. "He's having a seizure," the paramedic said under his breath. And that was when it all clicked in Sarah's mind. Everything that she had seen, his unsteady movements, the confusion in his eyes, the strange trembling of his hands, none of it had been from alcohol, but from a medical condition that Sarah hadn't even considered. Sarah's mind raced with thoughts of how she could have handled it differently if she had just taken a moment to think things through, to ask the right questions. Maybe she wouldn't be standing here now feeling like she had failed him. But it was too late for that. The damage had been done. The man was being escorted off the plane, now supported by the paramedics. As they guided him toward the waiting ambulance, Sarah's legs felt like jelly. She wasn't sure what to do or where to go. Her supervisor had already gone to speak with the captain, and Sarah was left standing in the middle of the terminal, trying to make sense of everything. She replayed the scene over and over in her mind, asking herself where she had gone wrong. But there was no answer. She couldn't figure out what had made her so certain he was drunk, when all the signs pointed to something much more serious. Sarah had worked so hard to be good at her job, to be able to spot trouble before it escalated, to protect her passengers and her crew. But this time she had failed, and she knew it as the hours passed, and the adrenaline began to fade. Sarah couldn't help but feel a creeping sense of dread. It wasn't just the guilt that weighed on her. It was the feeling that something worse was coming. She had made a decision that could cost her more than just her reputation. What if she lost her job? What if this mistake cost her everything she had worked so hard for? The thought gnawed at her. As she waited for news of the man's condition, she wanted to apologize to him. But it was too late. He had already been rushed to the hospital. No one had given her any updates on his condition, and all she could do now was wait and hope that she hadn't made things worse than they already were. Sarah stood by the window, staring out at the terminal lights, her mind racing with the events of the past few hours. She had never felt so out of control, so lost. She had always prided herself on being a reliable flight attendant, on keeping calm in any situation. But this was different. Her heart ached as she replayed the look on the man's face, the confusion and fear in his eyes when she accused him of being drunk, and how quickly the situation had spiraled out of her control. She glanced down at her phone, her hands shaking as she scrolled through the messages and missed calls. But none of them were from the hospital, none of them were from the crew. They had all gone their separate ways after the incident had been cleared up, and Sarah was left to deal with the aftermath on her own. It had been hours since the plane had landed, and still there was no word on the man's condition. Sarah had tried to call the hospital, but was told there were no updates. She had tried to reach out to her supervisor, but he had been in meetings all afternoon. She had tried everything she could think of, but nothing seemed to make the crushing weight of guilt go away. As she stood there in the empty terminal, the silence around her felt deafening. The air seemed thick with uncertainty, and Sarah's mind continued to spiral with questions that didn't have answers. What if the man's condition was worse than they thought? What if he had been too sick to get help in time? What if she had caused something worse by making the wrong call? She tried to push those thoughts aside, but they kept creeping back in every time. She closed her eyes. She could see the man's trembling hands, his pale face, and the paramedics rushing to his side. She could still hear the words of the paramedic echoing in her mind. "He's having a seizure." The words repeated over and over like a drumbeat. She couldn't escape. Sarah let out a deep breath and walked toward the gate. She didn't know where she was going or why, but it felt like she needed to do something. She couldn't just stand there and wait for the consequences to catch up to her. She had to take action. Somehow she couldn't undo the past. But maybe she could still make things right. She found herself standing outside the small office that housed the flight crew. She could see the faint shadows of people inside. But the door was closed and locked. Sarah hesitated for a moment before knocking quietly. She had no plan, no idea what to say, but she needed to speak to someone, and there was only one person she could think of who might have an answer. Her supervisor opened the door slowly, his face unreadable, and his eyes tired. Sarah's stomach tightened. As she met his gaze, he stepped aside to let her in, and she followed him into the room where the other flight attendants were gathered. They all looked up at her in silence. Sarah felt the weight of their gazes on her, their eyes full of curiosity, and something else, disappointment maybe. Or was it just concern? She wasn't sure. She felt suddenly small under their scrutiny. They all knew what had happened. They all knew what she had done. And now it felt like the whole crew was waiting for her to explain herself. But she didn't know how. She didn't have the words to make any of this right. How could she explain that she had misjudged a man's condition? How could she possibly make them understand how badly she felt for the mistake she had made? Her supervisor gestured for her to sit down, and she did not trusting herself to speak for a moment. She cleared her throat before meeting his eyes, her voice barely above a whisper. "I thought he was drunk," she said softly. "I didn't realize he was having a medical emergency." Her supervisor didn't say anything at first. He simply studied her, his expression unreadable. Sarah could feel the weight of the silence pressing down on her. It stretched on, until she wasn't sure how much longer she could take it. Finally he spoke. "Sarah, this isn't the end of your career, but you need to take responsibility for what happened. You need to learn from it." Sarah nodded slowly, her eyes filled with unshed tears. It wasn't the answer she had hoped for, but it was the truth, and she knew it. The days that followed were a blur for Sarah. As she tried to come to terms with what had happened, the incident was still fresh in her mind, and the weight of her mistake lingered over her like a shadow she couldn't escape. Each day felt like a reminder of her failure. Her coworkers treated her with polite distance. Some of them spoke to her like nothing had changed, but Sarah knew better. She could feel the unspoken tension in the air, like a cold draft running through the crew room. The only person who hadn't been distant was her supervisor, and even his presence felt heavy now. Every time he spoke to her, it was with a certain formality that made her uncomfortable. His words were measured, like he was trying to guide her, but also distance himself from her mistake. No one had told her anything about the man's condition. No one had given her any updates. All she knew was that he had been rushed to the hospital. After they had landed, she had sent a message to the hospital, but received no reply. There were no phone calls, no news. All she could do was wonder if he was okay, or if he had suffered because of her actions at night. She replayed the scene over and over in her head, the way he had looked at her with confusion, the way he had moved slowly as if his body wasn't cooperating with him, the way she had misread everything. And now she was left with nothing but regret. The guilt gnawed at her, constantly keeping her awake. When she closed her eyes, all she could see was his pale face, his trembling hands, and the paramedics rushing him away. She wished she had done more. She wished she had paid more attention. She wished she had seen the signs that he was sick, and not just drunk. But it was too late for that now. She had done what she had done, and now she had to face the consequences. She couldn't escape them, no matter how hard she tried. Her phone buzzed late one evening. As she sat in her apartment, trying to distract herself with a book, she glanced down and saw an unfamiliar number. She hesitated for a moment before answering. "Hello," she said, her voice shaking slightly. "This is Sarah from Flight 714. There was a pause on the other end before the voice spoke again. "This is Detective Harris from Miami PD. We've been trying to get in touch with you regarding the incident on the flight." Sarah's heart skipped a beat. Her throat went dry, and she immediately stood up. She had never been contacted by the police before. Her mind raced with 100 different thoughts. Was this about the man? Was he pressing charges? Had she made the situation worse than she had thought? "What is this about?" Sarah asked, her voice trembling. "We need you to come down to the station for a few questions about your involvement in the incident," the detective said. Sarah's hands trembled. As she held the phone, her mind was spinning. She didn't know what to think. She hadn't done anything illegal. She hadn't meant to hurt anyone. But now she was being contacted by the police. And she had no idea what this meant. She felt her stomach churn with anxiety. She had made a mistake. But did that really warrant police involvement? She wasn't sure. But she knew one thing for certain: this was only going to get worse. The detective gave her the address of the station and asked her to come down in the morning. As he ended the call, Sarah stood there for a long time, her mind spinning. As she tried to make sense of it all, what did they want from her? Why was she being questioned? She thought back to the flight again, to the moment when she had accused the man of being drunk, and how quickly the situation had escalated. But nothing about it seemed criminal to her. She had just been doing her job. Hadn't she? She hadn't known about his medical condition. How was she supposed to know? She had never seen a seizure before, had never dealt with a passenger in that kind of distress. Her heart raced as she tried to calm herself. But she couldn't shake the feeling that something terrible was about to happen. She was already at her lowest point. And now it felt like things were about to get worse. She had no idea how deep she was about to get pulled into this mess. The next morning, Sarah woke up to an empty apartment, her alarm clock blaring in the distance, as if it too was warning her about what lay ahead. She sat up in bed slowly, the weight of the previous day's events hanging heavily over her. Her hands still shook as she grabbed her phone to check the time the detective had asked her to come in early. And she didn't want to be late, but more than that, she didn't want to face whatever awaited her at the station. She thought about the man on the plane, the way he had looked at her, the way she had misjudged him. And she felt the guilt rise up again. Like a tidal wave, she stood up and moved toward the bathroom, trying to go through the motions of getting ready as quickly as possible. But everything felt like a blur. She couldn't focus. Her mind was too consumed by what was to come. She brushed her teeth in silence and ran a comb through her hair. But the mirror reflected a woman she barely recognized, someone who had once been confident and sure of herself, now stood in front of a reflection of someone who had failed, who had made an irreversible mistake. She put on her uniform in a daze, not even sure if she was doing it right. But she couldn't stop now. She had to go. She had to face whatever consequences awaited her. She needed to clear her name. She needed to know what was going to happen to her career. Sarah left her apartment and headed toward the police station, her footsteps heavy with each step. She arrived at the station a few minutes early, but the waiting room was already filled with people, most of them looking just as anxious and nervous. As she felt, she took a seat in the corner of the room, her eyes scanning the surroundings as she waited for the detective to call her. In every few seconds, her phone buzzed in her pocket. But she didn't dare look at it, not when she knew there were too many unknowns. She couldn't focus on anything but the dread building in her chest. Each passing minute felt like an eternity. And she couldn't help but wonder what would happen if things went terribly wrong. What if they pressed charges against her? What if she lost her job? What if the man never forgave her? What if he sued her for what she had done? Her mind raced with dark possibilities, and she couldn't stop them, no matter how hard she tried. She glanced around the room and noticed that the people there seemed to be staring at her too, their eyes lingering on her with curiosity and judgment. But Sarah couldn't bring herself to care about what they thought. All she cared about was the man and what she had done to him. She had never felt more alone than she did in that moment. Finally, a door opened, and a voice called her name, Sarah Donovan. She stood up slowly, her legs feeling like jelly as she walked toward the detective's office. The door shut behind her as she entered, and she was left alone with Detective Harris, who sat at his desk, his eyes focused on a folder in front of him. "Have a seat," he said in a low voice. Sarah sat down across from him, her stomach tight with anxiety. She couldn't bring herself to look him in the eyes. Not yet. She focused on the desk, in front of her, trying to steady her breathing. "I know you're probably confused about why we called you in, Detective Harris," began his tone calm but firm. "But I need you to understand that we're just gathering information right now. We're not accusing you of anything, but the situation needs to be cleared up." Sarah nodded slowly, but her heart pounded in her chest. As she waited for him to continue, she wasn't sure if it was a good thing or a bad thing that he hadn't made any accusations, yet the uncertainty only made her more anxious. "We've spoken to the man who was on the plane," he continued. "His name is John Hartley. He's a businessman from Chicago. He's been in and out of the hospital for a few years now due to a medical condition that causes him to have seizures. He's been on medication for it, but sometimes it can still affect him in unexpected ways." Sarah's heart sank as the detective spoke. The man wasn't drunk after all, but sick, and she had misjudged him so completely she wanted to apologize, but she didn't know how to begin. Her throat tightened with guilt. "What happened on the flight wasn't something you could have predicted," Detective Harris said, his voice softening a little. "But we need to get your statement about the incident from your perspective." Sarah opened her mouth, but no words came out. She felt like she was drowning in the weight of it all. She had made one simple mistake, but now it felt like her entire life was unraveling in front of her. She took a deep breath and began to speak, her voice shaking slightly as she recounted the events of the flight. She explained how she had thought he was drunk, how she had tried to handle the situation with the crew and the paramedics, and how she had tried to do what was best, even though she now knew that she had been wrong. Detective Harris listened to every word without interrupting, but when she finished, he leaned back in his chair and regarded her carefully. "I understand your side of things," he said after a long silence, "but you need to understand the severity of your actions." Sarah swallowed hard. She wasn't sure what he meant, but she could tell that this was far from over. Sarah sat there in silence, her hands gripping the edge of the chair as the detective's words lingered in the air like a heavy fog. She couldn't shake the feeling that the worst was yet to come. She had made a mistake, yes, but she had never imagined it would spiral into something like this. She had always believed that if she just did her job right, everything would work out. But now she was sitting across from a police detective who seemed to weigh every word she said with more scrutiny than she could handle. Detective Harris leaned forward slightly and locked his gaze with hers, his eyes steady and intense. "Sarah, you need to understand something," he said, his voice measured and serious. "The consequences of what happened on that flight could be more than just a misjudgment. You've accused someone of being drunk in front of a whole plane of people, and in the process you've made that person's situation worse." Sarah's breath hitched in her chest as she tried to absorb what he was saying. He was right. She had done that. She had made the situation worse than it needed to be. She thought back to how she had tried to handle it with the crew, how she had been so sure of herself in her decision, even though her gut was telling her something wasn't right now. She saw the full picture, and it was nothing like she had imagined. The man had been having a medical emergency, not a drunken episode, and she had turned him into a spectacle for all the wrong reasons. "He could have suffered much more because of your actions," Detective Harris continued, his voice steady, but there was a hint of something else behind it. Maybe concern, or maybe even frustration. A delay in medical intervention could have led to serious consequences, but luckily the paramedics were able to get to him quickly. Sarah closed her eyes for a moment, feeling a lump form in her throat. She couldn't help but think of what could have happened if the paramedics hadn't gotten to him in time, if she had been wrong about him completely, and he had been left to suffer alone in silence. She couldn't live with that thought. The weight of it all pressed down on her chest like an anvil. She felt like she was suffocating under the responsibility of her actions. And yet there was more to come. "John Hartley is an important man in his field," Detective Harris continued. "His health is already fragile, and you've made things difficult for him by accusing him of something that wasn't true. This has affected his personal life, as well as reputation has taken a hit because of it, and he's considering legal action. Sarah's blood ran cold. At the mention of legal action, she hadn't even thought about the consequences of that. How much worse could it get if he chose to press charges? She didn't know how to respond. How could she apologize for something like this? What words could possibly make up for what she had done? Everything felt hopeless, and she felt small sitting there in front of the detective, as if she was being judged for every single mistake she had ever made. "I never meant to cause any harm," Sarah finally whispered, her voice breaking. "I thought he was drunk. I didn't know he was sick." The detective didn't say anything at first. He just looked at her for a long time before speaking again. "I understand that you didn't know," he said, his tone softening slightly. "But you need to understand that your actions have consequences, not just for you, but for him too." Sarah nodded slowly, her mind racing with 1,000 thoughts. She could feel the pressure building as she tried to process everything the detective was saying to her. She wanted to apologize to John Hartley. But would he even listen to her now? Would he forgive her for what she had done? She could feel the tears welling up in her eyes. But she didn't want to cry, not here, not in front of him. But the emotions were too much, the guilt, the shame, the helplessness. They all rushed to the surface, and she couldn't hold them back any longer. "I'm so sorry," she choked out, her voice trembling. "I didn't mean for any of this to happen. I never wanted to hurt him. I thought I was doing my job. I was just trying to keep the flight safe." Detective Harris watched her closely, and for a moment there was a shift in his expression, as if he understood the weight she was carrying. But then he sighed and leaned back in his chair again. "You need to think about how to move forward," he said quietly. "You can't change what happened, but you can control how you respond to it, and how you take responsibility for it." Sarah wiped her eyes with the back of her hand and nodded slowly. She didn't know how she would face John Hartley or how she would explain herself to the crew, but she knew one thing: she couldn't run from this. She had to face the consequences, no matter how hard they were, even if it meant losing everything she had worked for. The days after her meeting with Detective Harris felt like they were dragging on in slow motion. Sarah couldn't escape the heaviness in her chest, the guilt that gnawed at her every waking moment. She replayed the conversation with the detective over and over in her head, his words echoing in her mind. No matter how hard she tried to push them away, she knew she had to face the consequences. But what were those consequences going to look like? How would she ever face the man she had wronged? How could she look him in the eye? After everything she had done, she spent the next few days in a haze, trying to keep busy at work. But her focus was shot. Every conversation seemed to carry an undertone of judgment. No one said anything directly, but she could feel a shift in the way people looked at her, the way they spoke to her, as if they were all waiting for the fallout. She hadn't heard from John Hartley since the flight, not directly anyway. The hospital hadn't given her any updates, and she had refrained from trying to contact him again. She wasn't sure what she would even say if she did. Her supervisor had warned her that the situation wasn't over yet, and that the company was still assessing the potential fallout from the incident. Her stomach churned every time she thought about it. She had already been reprimanded for making a snap judgment, but she had a feeling there was more coming. As much as she tried to act normal, every part of her felt like it was falling apart. She felt like she was walking on a tightrope, constantly afraid that any wrong move would send her crashing down. The weight of her actions seemed to get heavier with each passing day, and the more she tried to bury it, the more it consumed her thoughts. She sat alone in her apartment one evening, trying to distract herself by reading, but nothing could hold her attention for long. The words on the page blurred together as her mind kept drifting back to that day, the way the man had looked at her when she accused him of being drunk, how helpless he had seemed. She had been so certain of herself, so sure that she was doing the right thing, but now it all felt so wrong. Every detail of the flight seemed to play out in her mind like a movie that she couldn't stop watching, and it made her sick to her stomach. She couldn't bear to think of how he had suffered, how she had failed him. She finally grabbed her phone and looked at the missed calls and messages from her family. They had been trying to reach her all day, but she hadn't been able to bring herself to talk to them. They didn't know what had happened. They didn't know how much she was struggling with the situation, and she didn't want to burden them with it. But tonight she decided she couldn't keep it to herself anymore. She needed someone to talk to, someone who would understand. She dialed her mother's number and waited for her to pick up the phone. Her mother's voice was warm and familiar when she answered. "Sarah, is everything okay?" She asked, concern evident in her tone. "Mom, I need to talk to you." Sarah's voice wavered as she spoke, her heart racing. "It's about the flight, the man I accused of being drunk." There was a brief silence on the other end, and Sarah could hear her mother taking in a deep breath. "I'm so sorry," Sarah continued, her voice breaking. "I was wrong. I misjudged him, and I don't know how to make it right." Her mother didn't say anything at first, but Sarah could hear her moving around in the background before her voice returned soft and calm. "Sarah, I know you're going through a tough time, but you need to be kind to yourself. You made a mistake, we all make them. But what matters now is how you handle it." Sarah felt a lump in her throat as her mother's words washed over her. She hadn't expected her to say that, but it was what she needed to hear more than anything. "You can't change what happened," her mother continued, "but you can learn from it and do better next time." Sarah wiped her eyes and nodded even though her mother couldn't see her. "I just feel like I ruined everything," she said quietly. "I might lose my job. I might lose everything." Her mother's voice softened. "You've always been strong, Sarah. You've always bounced back from tough situations. And this will be no different." Her words were a balm to Sarah's troubled mind, but they didn't erase the fear that still clung to her. She knew her mother was right, but the unknowns were terrifying her. There was still the question of whether John Hartley would pursue legal action against her, and whether she would face further disciplinary action at work. She didn't know what the future held, and that uncertainty was eating her alive as she hung up the phone. Sarah sat in silence for a while, staring at the walls of her apartment. The words her mother had said still echoed in her mind, but they didn't bring her the comfort she had hoped for. She wanted to believe that she could move past this, but there was no denying the gravity of the situation, and no easy way out. She took a deep breath and decided that she couldn't just keep waiting for things to unfold. She had to take control of the situation. She needed to find John Hartley. She needed to apologize to him personally, no matter how difficult it would be, no matter how much it scared her. Sarah sat at her kitchen table, staring at her phone, wondering if she was making the right decision. She had thought about this moment for days. Now each time it seemed to get harder and harder to make the call. But she knew that if she didn't take action now, she would never have the chance to make things right. She had to face John Hartley. She had to apologize in person, even if it meant swallowing her pride and risking everything. She took a deep breath and dialed the number she had gotten from the hospital staff. It rang twice before a voice picked up. "Hello." The voice was deep, but calm. Sarah's throat went dry for a second. She almost hung up. But she steadied herself and spoke. "Mr. Hartley, my name is Sarah Donovan. I was the flight attendant on the flight you were on a few days ago." There was a long pause on the other end, and for a moment Sarah wondered if he had hung up, but then he spoke, his voice tight. "Yes, I remember the flight. I remember you." His words were flat and without emotion. Sarah felt a lump form in her throat, but she pushed it down and continued. "I know you must be upset with me, and I completely understand why," she said, her voice shaking slightly. "I just wanted to tell you that I am so sorry for what happened. I made a mistake, and I misjudged you, and I will regret that for the rest of my life." Another pause. "I don't expect you to forgive me," she continued quickly, "but I wanted you to know that I see the harm I caused, and I want to make it right. If there's anything I can do to help, I'll do it." There was a long silence on the other end, and for a moment Sarah thought he wasn't going to respond. But then he spoke again, this time his voice softer. "I don't know if there's anything you can do to make it right, but I appreciate you calling." His voice cracked slightly, but he cleared his throat before continuing. "It's been a rough few days for me, and honestly, I don't know how to process everything that happened." Sarah felt her heart ache at his words, and she wished more than anything that she could take everything back, that she could somehow undo her mistake. But she knew that was impossible. All she could do now was own up to it, and hope that it wasn't too late for redemption. "I understand," she said quietly. "I can't imagine how hard this must be for you. I just want you to know that I truly regret my actions, and I'll do whatever it takes to help however I can." For the first time in the conversation, there was a shift in his tone. It wasn't warm, but it wasn't cold either. "I don't know what happens now," he said slowly, "but I don't think I'm going to press charges or anything like that. I just need time to figure things out." Sarah let out a breath. She didn't realize she had been holding. She was relieved, but also filled with a new kind of anxiety. She knew that time wouldn't erase the damage done, and she didn't know if things could ever go back to the way they were. But she was grateful that he wasn't going to take the situation further. She had expected him to be angrier with her, to want more from her. But this was different. "Thank you," she said softly. "I really appreciate your understanding, and I promise I'll do everything I can to make up for this." "We'll see," he replied curtly, and then there was a pause. "I'm sorry that you're going through this too," he added after a moment. "I don't know what to tell you except that mistakes happen, but it doesn't make it easier to forgive them." Sarah nodded, even though he couldn't see her, the weight of his words settling over her. "I understand," she whispered. The conversation hung there for a moment before he spoke again. "Take care of yourself." His voice was tired, now softer, as though he was ready to end the conversation. Sarah knew this was her last chance to say something that might bring him some closure. "I truly hope that you're okay," she said quietly. "And I'm sorry again for everything." There was no response for a long moment, but then she heard him sigh lightly. "Goodbye, Sarah," he said finally, and the call ended. Sarah sat there staring at the screen for a long time. The tension in her chest had loosened, but only slightly. She felt a small sense of relief, but there was still so much uncertainty. She had done what she needed to do, but the road to recovery was far from over. She didn't know if she could ever fully make up for what she had done, but she knew one thing for sure: she would spend the rest of her life trying to be better, trying to make things right, even if it meant facing uncomfortable truths and painful consequences. She had to learn from her mistakes and move forward with as much grace as she could muster.